In today's Farm Report, the USDA has begun developing a vaccine to combat the avian influenza and has asked permission to start stockpiling it in an event that the avian influenza returns. But, as the USDA's Rod Bain reports, that doesn't mean that the USDA may use it if an outbreak happens.
Now, a recent USDA request does not necessarily mean it plans to combat any future outbreaks of highly pathogenic avian influenza through the use of vaccines for poultry.
It has to be clear that this is a preparatory move by USDA to be ready with all tools that it can possibly have available. Doesn't mean that we'll use the vaccine strategy. We just want to have it as a tool in our toolbox in case there's a need to use it. We want to be aware of what the impact of that vaccination use would be for trade in the entire poultry sector in the United States before we go to a vaccine strategy.
But Jack Scherer, the Agriculture Department's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, says it is that precautionary approach that led to a request for proposal from companies for high-path AI vaccine doses that can equip the National Veterinary Stockpile.
The request for proposal, what that does is it sort of informs companies that should we decide to use vaccine, we want to have vaccines available that are potent, effective, and pure. So we want them to begin development on those vaccines with the idea that we want to stockpile some of those vaccines to be prepared in the event that there is another outbreak, that if we do decide to use vaccine, that it's available.
Dr. Scherer says the focus will be on quick production of vaccine for the Eurasian H5 strain of the avian flu virus, the strain that circulated through domestic poultry flocks earlier this year. And there is no timeline per se for companies to submit proposals.
It's ongoing, and we'll continue to evaluate and process and look at the companies through the Center for Veterinary Biologics that'll be evaluating all the vaccines and the proposals that are brought forward for purity, potency, and effectiveness. So it's an ongoing process to look at each company and each vaccine to see that it'll work for us.
Another point on the request for proposal for high-path AI vaccines.
There may be more than one vaccine, and there may be several different types of vaccine that work differently. We may use live virus, modified live virus. They may use killer and activated viruses. It just depends on what's needed and what the vaccine will do and its effectiveness with the birds.
Scherer says in addition to the proposal request, APHIS will issue an environmental impact statement evaluating the potential impacts of using a vaccine in the event of a high-path avian influenza outbreak. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Fed steer prices last week using USDA averages were down to about $147 a hundredweight, but already there's a little upward pressure.
Retailers are lining up supplies for Labor Day featuring, so there's been some increase.
And USDA livestock analyst Shale Shagam says for this third quarter of the year, July through September, prices should be averaging about $158, maybe down just a little bit from the same quarter last year. Fourth quarter, maybe a bump back up to an average $161.
Which is still going to be down a little bit from the $166 that we saw in the fourth quarter of 2014.
Right now, feedlots have about 3% more cattle than this time a year ago, and as placements increase later this year, marketings go up.
We are looking at prices to be gradually diminishing over time, probably averaging 155 to 167 for an annual average in 2016, about or just slightly below 2014's numbers.
Certainly not a price collapse by any means. Shagam says prices may also be influenced by what consumers do as beef prices begin to level off and possibly decline. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
Having good neighbor policies in place when it comes to applying manure can help minimize the possibility of issues with neighbors. Dan Martins with the University of Minnesota Extension Service Office has more.
I talked recently about a couple of good neighbor practices related to hauling manure. There are also a number of best management practices to keep in mind through the fall manure hauling season. This also calls for common sense. A lot of people are doing some of these, and SWCD and RCS offices might have cost share programs related to some of this. One is to apply manure at rates based on nutrient needs of the crop. Regular soil testing is a key to accomplishing this goal. Just like you use a soil test to make decisions about the most effective rates for applying commercial fertilizer, soil testing helps people make more effective manure application decisions also. Testing the manure tells you the mix of nutrients in the manure. Soil grid sampling is commonly based on 2.5 acre grids across a field, but could be done based on soil maps, topography, or the surface color soil patterns you see when you do tillage. Grid sampling has shown significant benefits in doing variable rate lime applications. You might apply 2 ton of lime per acre across 40 acres based on a composite soil sample. Grid sampling might show that you don't need any lime on some parts of the field and that you need 3 or 4 tons on other areas. You can make better use of the lime by putting more of it where it is needed. It's not uncommon to see differences in other nutrients as well. Sometimes you get grid patterns based on where you have spread more manure over the years. Extension educator Randy Pepin, working on a special project, has offered some discussion about grid sampling that has helped some people make better decisions about where they spread more or less manure, often indicated by differences in phosphorus levels. Another best management practice is to spread manure as uniform as possible. For some spreaders, that means spreading wheel track to wheel track. If manure applications are not fairly uniform, taking soil samples, interpreting results, and spreading fertilizer or other manure is a little bit like throwing darts. Uniformity can also be affected by time. If you haul manure on a field over the course of a month, then nitrogen losses will vary accordingly. We're storing a lot more of the manure these days, so that's probably less of an issue. Another BMP for fall applied manure is to apply after soil temperatures are below 50 degrees. Much the same concept we use in waiting to apply anhydrous ammonia until soil temperatures have dropped below 50 degrees. We know that custom applicators would have a tough time getting things done if everyone waited until temperatures were below 50 degrees. That can be difficult for farmers who spread their own manure in a mix of all the fall work that needs to be done also. For the next couple of years, Randy Pepin will be working on a project to see how cover crops might fit with manure applications. If you need to apply manure in the fall before we get below 50 degrees soil temperatures, can a cover crop on the land help to capture some of the most readily available nitrogen and other nutrients to reduce losses? I'm Dan Martins with U of M Extension, and I hope again that common sense prevails through the fall harvest and manure application season.
After an early day drop in soybean and corn prices Monday, markets finally rallied later on, and then all eyes were on USDA's condition reports, and basically compared to a week ago,
no real change in the corn and soybean conditions.
Agriculture Department meteorologist Brad Rippey and USDA puts
corn steady at 69% good to excellent, 10% very poor to poor. Those numbers aren't too far from what we saw this time last year.
Only 3 states have at least 20% of their corn rated poor to very poor. That's Indiana, Ohio, and North Carolina. Now for soybean condition this week.
Steady at 63% good to excellent, 11% very poor to poor.
Again, only 3 states with 20% or more of the crop in poor to very poor shape: Indiana, Ohio, and Missouri. Crop development for beans and corn, though, a little behind average. Nothing to fret about. And as far as weather bringing corn and bean ratings down,
nothing in the forecast that would indicate any problems looking ahead the next few days.
In Washington, Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.